This is chapter 10, section 4, and that's on evidence of evolution. The key idea here is that evidence of common ancestry among species comes from many sources. Okay, so evidence for evolution in Darwin's time came from several sources. The first one here is going to be fossils. So, as evolution goes, so you say we have a bird. And, the theory goes that this is, and down here we'll call this time. Okay? We'll say this bird, over time turn into bird. We'll call it bird 1, bird 2. We'll just start writing B, B3. This one goes into B4. Maybe this one goes to B5 and B6. The point is that as time goes on, this one bird can evolve into different types of birds that all of these birds, they share a common ancestor. So this would be the right here, the ancestor. All right, the ancestor bird. So, if this is true, then what you would expect to find is that you would find some of these, say that this is modern day, where these are your birds that live now, you would expect to find these fossilized remains of these older birds. And, that's kind of at least what we think we're finding when we find fossils. That's the thought. When we see a fossil in a layer of rock, that used to be a species of a certain animal that used to live, and something happened where that animal died, and the conditions were right to where it made a fossil. And the thought is that this fossil here was an animal that was an ancestor of some animal that currently exists now. So when you see a fossil, fossils in older layers are going to naturally be older, or you could also call that primitive, compared to a fossil that you're going to find in upper layer. Upper layer being like if this is, if this is your rock here, and this is like, a person on the land, this would be upper, so newer. This would be the lower layer, or the older. All right, another evidence for evolution is going to be the study of geography. Where, so say we have these island species, and, if I was good at drawing, I don't know, we got some sort of landmass here, and say we have another, we'll call it a continent, and we have another continent here, whatever. The species that you find on these islands are going to be more similar to the species on this continent. So the birds you were to find on these islands are going to be more similar to the birds you find on these islands than the birds that you find on these islands. And so that's just kind of the idea that over time, way back when, some birds, some ancestor birds migrated from this continent to these islands. And in addition, you're also going to see variation on islands, just as Darwin found. When he went to one island, he saw that the species of animals, the birds and the tortoises, were different on one island than another. Another evidence is going to be the idea of developmental similarities. Meaning that, so you can have one larva. So larva is like, it's kind of like saying like an embryo-ish, baby-ish. It's like this old. It's whenever this is, first, this baby, I guess if you will, that this embryo is first forming, it looks, for this crab, this adult crab and this adult barnacle, they look nearly identical, look very much the same. Yet this can turn into this barnacle, or it can turn into this crab. And it's this idea that, you can have these larvae that look very similar, but it can produce a very different adult body form. In other words, you can have a similar embryo, but diverse organisms lend some evidence to evolution. Another thing with the embryos, you also have like human embryos. If you look at like a picture of embryos of like humans and fish and just different types of mammals, um, uh, and just other organisms in general, you start seeing the embryos will be at a stage where they look really similar. And so, kind of the argument goes that, well, all these embryos look so similar at a certain stage, at the younger stages, and then as they progress in time, as they get closer and closer to gestation or the mother having the baby, that's when that older form starts to differentiate into the newer, or not so much newer, but the different life forms. Okay, and then also the study of anatomy can give you some evidence for evolution. So an interesting thing with anatomy is like the all the bones here that make up the human hand are going to be the same bones that are going to make up this mole foot here. So these bones are color coded here. If you trace the colors, and these same bones are also the bones that make up a bat wing. So similar structure, but different function. Obviously, a human hand is not the same as a mole's foot. We don't walk on our hands, and both of these certainly aren't a wing that that we use to fly. And then the opposite of a homologous structure is going to be an analogous structure. So if you make like an analogy, it's like you're comparing two different things, but you're kind of making a connection between them. It would be literally what I just did. I made an analogy of an analogous structure. It's kind of ironic. If you didn't get that, then story of my life. But anyways, so you got a fly wing here and a bat wing. So they're both wings. They both use these to fly. However, they're similar function, but not the same structure. Meaning that these two are not closely related. So similar function, but not the same structure is going to be analogous. All right, and the final one is going to be what's called, or not so much evidence, but just, well, yeah, you would call it evidence still, would be the vestigial structures. So, as the theory of evolution would go, if you have organisms slowly adapting to their environment based on them having these different adaptations that allow them to survive, the thought would be eventually you might have certain old structures that at one point in the organism's or the species history had a function. Later on in time, that organ or that structure could lose its function, and that structure would be called a vestigial structure. So the example is an ostrich's wings. So somewhere way back in time, the ancestor, the ancestor of this ostrich could fly with the wings, but now these ostriches, their wings are vestigial structures. They're structures that they no longer serve a purpose. They're just kind of there, and they kind of might use them for mating purposes, to attract a mate, but they aren't used to fly anymore. Okay, that's going to do it for this lecture.